The Extremist Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
Hello and welcome to the Extremist Publishing podcast. I'm Tom Christie. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Robert Murray, who's the author of The Spirit of Robbie Burns and also The Grocer's Boy, A Slice of His Life in 1950s Scotland. In his first book, Robbie explains the trials and tribulations of a grocery delivery boy in 1950s Tayside, all the way until he became the youngest manager of any William Lowe branch in Scotland. Robbie has now written a new book, The Grocer's Boy Rides Again, which takes his story from the early 1960s all the way up to the end of the decade, and explains more than a few surprises along the way. Robbie, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
Well, I must say I very much enjoyed your new book. It takes us in some quite unusual directions, starting in traditional, what I imagine we could call traditional grocery retailing, through to further education, the Grocers Institute, and then the corporate world after that. It sounds like it was an exciting journey.
Well, it's a journey that came about step by step. The word career didn't come into my vocabulary very much at school. I didn't set out with a career in mind. In my educational experience, I left school at the age of 15. I found enough knowledge of myself to know that I enjoyed working in the retail grocery trade. I think it was the contact with people, the busyness, the active life, and a hard life, long hours and low pay. Retail grocery was described in those days, although I didn't know it at the age when I was a message boy or an apprentice, but I later learned it was described as the Cinderella of the retail trades, largely because of the long hours and relatively low pay. So I had no plans as a career. Things developed in strange ways.
Now you describe, certainly at the beginning of your book, some of the challenges that were involved in traditional counter service, but you also explain the period of rapid transition that was taking place at that time, as groceries gave way to the supermarkets that we recognise today. What do you think were the key changes that were taking place at that point?
The key changes, strangely enough, they began in very small ways. For example, in the William Lowe experience I had in my early days, we dealt with bulk products, bulk cheese, bulk butter, bulk lard, biscuits came in big boxes. Cut a long story short, pre-packaging hadn't actually taken place. And one of my first observations of all of that was when I moved from the Carnoustie branch to Dundee. And in my first branch, which I managed, it was a small shop. Consequently, there was no better way to provide the stock other than in pre-packaging, because there wasn't space. So somewhere along the line, decisions had been made by the company to start pre-packaging. And I think that was the beginning of the changes that came about, because what followed was self-selection, and then followed by fully blown self-service. None of that would work while there was bulk products like cheese and butter being handled. So the precursor to self-selection and self-service was pre-packaging. So that was my first tiny observation of changes coming about.
Now, William Lowe, which is the company that you worked for, has long been regarded as one of the most respected and immediately recognisable of Scottish brands. Although the company ceased trading in 1994, it's still remembered with great affection, to the point that some museums, such as the McManus Museum and Art Gallery in Dundee, have displays which remember William Lowe in its heyday. Do you think it's one of those kind of companies that are so iconic that its name will live on for many years to come?
I think it's a name that'll go in the history books of retailing, but I don't know. There are names, if one goes back to the grocery trade with the Liptons and the Galbraiths, Allied Suppliers. These are names of yesteryear. There are names which they do still appear in books, factual stories of the development of the retail grocery trade. Strange enough, William Lowe and Company, I remember the date vividly. I wasn't there, but 1868 was when William Lowe and Company was founded. Strange enough, the same year that Sainsbury's was founded, for example. And I've read up on the background of the retail grocery development in Scotland. And around that same period, the 1860s, 70s, 80s, were times when the multiple grocery store was developing. Largely, probably solely, on the basis of the individual aspirations of one man that would start off these companies. That's how I saw it, and that's how it all began to take shape.
Now, in a remarkable twist of fate, you explain in your book how a fateful advertisement in a newspaper led you to a completely different change of pace in your career, and one which would take you from grocery retailing into the world of further education. How did that go?
It was quite surreal, I suppose. I moved at the age of, just coming up for the age of 19, to my first branch in Dundee. After 18 months, wearing on nearly 2 years, I moved to a second branch, larger branch. Incidentally, the larger branch was self-selection, so I began to see the changes coming about in that respect. I then had a strange move. With a very quick interview in the back shop one day, the area manager said, I'd like to move you on to another branch, the Perth Road branch in Dundee. Immediately my mind stepped back and wondered why this was happening, because Perth Road was still then a counter service branch. I thought I'd left counter service behind me. But the area manager explained, no, we're building a new supermarket next door to Perth Road, and it'll be a fully blown self-service store, and you're going to be the manager. So I was still there, age 23, with this prospect. And then, strangely enough, out of the blue, one of my in-laws had passed on a tiny little snippet from a newspaper which said, lecturer in distributive trades required, Commercial College Dundee, qualifications required, Grocery Institute exam passes, certificate in retail management. And I knew instinctively that nobody else, the certificate in retail management was a new course, and it had only run for the last 18 months or so in Dundee. And I knew nobody else on that course who also had a Grocer's Institute qualification. So I realised that I was in quite a unique situation. I had the qualifications, but therein lay a huge problem, because did I want to leave the bustling retail grocery trade or not? And I had to have a very fine, long thought about this. A few things came into play that I hadn't actually thought about until that very moment of this possibility of making a move. The first of these would be that security, and I have to say here that the success of a grocery branch manager, or indeed I suppose any branch manager in any business, is the success of the one's stock result, i.e. making your net profit? Are you making profit? It's a very simple statement to make. But the grocery retail manager in those days would be taking stock every 3 months. And in effect, if you had a bad stock, as the term went, that would be a very nervous moment. And if you had a second bad stock, quite a seriously worrying moment. And so there was a nervousness about the security and bad stocks. And I'll give some examples of that, Tom. Self-service meant that you were laying all your business through checkouts. And hitherto, you had people at the counter serving the customers, dealing with their purchases. Suddenly, everything, your whole profit depended on what was going through a checkout. In my case, in my one example in self-selection in the branch I moved to, I had one checkout lady. I had to be absolutely clear in my mind that that one checkout operator was efficient and honest. And I wouldn't know until 3 months came along whether I had actually made a profit. And that hung very seriously in my mind. There was something I'd never imagined, but as a manager I began to be quite serious about knowing where did the security of all of this lie. Another example would be in the receipt of grocery order materials, stock coming into the business. In a smaller branch, as a manager in a small branch, I did that personally. I checked every item coming in. I checked every single item on any delivery that came in to me. As delegation started and the management of a larger unit, that had to be delegated. That again, you could argue the manager's job was to make sure you've selected the correct staff and you've got trust in everything that's going on. But if there's any nervousness about that, that's a second area where I could be buying stock, but am I buying the stock I've ordered? Has something disappeared and never arrived on my shelves? So there were large areas of security that came into my thoughts. I went on to have an interview about the commercial college opportunity, and I discovered that the salary offered was quite a drop from what I had enjoyed. I had been enjoying relatively good money, plus bonuses because of my stock results. Everything was going very well. And somewhere around, in the time I recall, somewhere I was earning between £1,200, £1,400 a year. The grocery lecturer job was going to go down to something like 900. So I had the huge question mark in my mind. Do I want to proceed in a management retail grocery context with the new worries and in a new world of self-service, and do I want to drop to £900 per year? It was a very difficult decision. And after all, I had been an employee of William Lowe and Company since the age of 12. As a message boy, as an apprentice, I'd been extremely well looked after. I'd been invited to take days off for studying for my certificate in management principles. And so it seemed a harsh thing for me to even consider telling William Lowe and Company, thank you very much, thanks for all the help and development you've given me, and now I'm leaving. And that struck a very unhappy chord with me. I did not enjoy that aspect of it. But I began to seriously consider, I think perhaps at the end of it, Tom, by nature I'm a nervous person. I think I probably take a lot of worries home with me. And I learned from more senior managers on occasions when I chatted with more senior managers. The debate, the discussion invariably came round to their worries I could hear senior managers who'd been in the trade for many years expressing their doubts and fears about their stock results. And in my young 23-year-old brain, I began to think, here are men that I know now, chatting with them who might be in their 40s, expressing these issues. And so therefore, it gave me a big question in my mind. Is this the future I want? Am I equipped and strong enough mentally to tackle all of that? So perhaps it was a weak thing to do, difficult decision to make, but I made it, for better or for worse.
And you describe in your book a tremendous sense of camaraderie amongst you and your other colleagues within further education. Was that something that was typical of the time?
Well, I have to say, as a manager, as a young person, I was between my 19-year-old and up to the age of 23. As a manager, I immediately recognised there's a distinct gap between staff and management. I had to be quite serious in my outlook. There was no easy relationship to have, and yet retain authority and control without being too serious about that. And when I went into further education, for the first time in my working life, I found I had colleagues. I could speak with people in the staff room. I enjoyed the camaraderie. It was a joy. It opened a new world for me. And obviously, I was going home in the evenings with no worries of sales, stocks, losses, checkouts, stock takings, and so on. So it opened a new world for me. And yes, it was a huge plus, a gain in my existence of having a less trouble-free working life.
And the college that you talk about in your book, the Dundee Commercial College, at that point was actually split over a number of different locations throughout the city. That must have taken a bit of getting used to after having managed a commercial premises.
Yes. Again, I've just described changes in the retail grocery trade in their methodology of how things were being transferred from counter service shops into self-service shops. I took it for granted when I moved into further education that the way things were working there was that we had fundamentally the whole college was made up of several individual units. Annexes, I think, was the word that was used. So the main building was an old primary school in the Cowgate area of Dundee. That's where the principal was housed. That's where he had his secretaries. That's where the admin offices were. But there were other annexes around the city, and I began to realise that it was all about the development of a college, which obviously, looking back, I could understand. You couldn't build a college with X number of rooms to house an unknown number of classes, an unknown number of lecturers. So the slow growth of further education had to be paced very carefully. So I realised the way it was working was, as new courses came on stream, so a new annex would be opened up. And so these annexes became little units. Ultimately, someday, they would all join together and become part of Commercial College, which ultimately was built in the Constitution Hill area of Dundee. But that was the origins of that was the strategy, obviously, of the Education Department of Dundee City at the time, to make use of closed down primary school premises in the city. It was a very good plan, and it would be an economic way of developing a college.
After a number of successful years lecturing at the college, you discovered another advertisement, one which would lead you much further away than Dundee.
Again, I said earlier, Tom, I mean, I had no career plan in mind. Having said that, I said earlier, of course, I'd moved into further education with a drop in salary. There were only fundamentally two ways that I could tackle and regain some momentum in my salary level. One was to aspire to teach higher level subjects, and take on different groups of students, but mainly by improving qualifications. And I still to this day find it quite amazing that as a junior school leaver at the age of 15 with grocery exams behind me and a certificate in management principles, that's the only academic qualifications I had. I really began to see my way ahead in salary level was to embark on improving my qualifications. So I set out with a programme to furnish myself with Scottish O grades and higher grades. I started to think along these lines with the idea someday, ultimately, of going to study for a degree. That's the one way in which I could try to regain my salary level.
So it's an interesting thing because, I mean, the odds must have been stratospheric that not only one but two of those amazing opportunities came completely out of the blue with those advertisements. The second one taking you right down to the south of England.
Well, I was enjoying life in the college. I began to, after 5 years, I felt comfortable. Again, as I said earlier, with my colleagues and my immediate boss. There was only two of us, actually, in the distributive trades section at that point in time. That was beginning to develop slightly more. But again, one day, just by sheer chance, a grocery magazine was lying on a desk in the staff room at the same spot where the janitor came in with the tray and cups and saucers. And lo and behold, the magazine was open at a page where the job adverts appeared. And there was an advert there for a training development officer in England. And the employer was the Grocers Institute, a body which I knew well. I'd studied under the Institute. I'd been in touch with the Institute. I'd published a little pamphlet about the careers within the grocery trade. So the Institute knew my name, but it was a sheer piece of luck. Effectively, when I looked at the ad, it was going to almost double my salary with a car and all the usual expenses. But this was a post based in England as a training development officer. The role was going to be training development within companies. The training boards were being set up at that point in time, and the impact on training inside the retail grocery trade was being administered by the Distributive Industry Training Board itself, who were going to set a levy. So every company would pay a levy which would go into a fund, and this would be used to develop training within that industry. In the case of the grocery trade, what the Institute was seeking to do was to, in a sense, take further education largely out of college and get training inside a company. So a large part of this was to encourage companies to find the personnel inside their own organisation to develop training. And it's a rather staggering thing to think that my patch where I was going to develop training was north of the River Thames, south of the River Humber, and east of the M1 motorway. That whole area was what was being advertised. However, I made an immediate phone call. It seemed like it was heaven sent for me in every respect. To cut a long story short, after a trip to London, I secured the job and found myself based in St Ives, Huntingdon, which was more or less central in my patch.
Well, it's obvious from reading your book that you approached your time in further education with great enthusiasm, that you took a great deal of time to make sure that the syllabus was being communicated effectively, and that it's very obvious that you took a great deal of care and concern for the students that you were working with. How do you feel those experiences set you up for your time in the Grocers Institute, and how did you make use of those skills when you were down there?
I think the background of further education was very important. It gave me an insight into not only the Grocers Institute courses, but of course the city and guilds as a body was very active in running retail distributive courses. And one of the things which impressed me greatly, that while I was working in the college, in the early part of my employment in the college, I was sent on a course, a week's course, to London. It was based accommodation and lecture rooms in some parts of the University of London, but it was an amazing course. We heard from Lord Sainsbury himself, we heard from trade union top people, we visited Marks and Spencer's head office at Marble Arch, we visited and saw the behind the scenes in Harrods, and one of the things that struck me was that one of the after dinner speakers made the comment that the retail grocery trade had been a Cinderella for far too long, and it was time to start improving training, education. And after that 1 week's course, I went home and felt that there was some real merit in what we were really trying to do inside further education. So when the time came to go back and work in the Institute, I had a much more confident feel about the place of further education in the whole scheme of things. And then the idea of adding on training to that whole process was quite interesting to me, because it was going to be the two arms of training and education, which was the future for improving efficiencies and the management of retail grocery stores.
Well, during your time at Dundee Commercial College, it's very obvious that you energetically steered a fascinating course which would give people a real insight into many different aspects of retail and distribution. And from then, of course, moving down to the Grocers Institute in London, it's also very clear that you had this enthusiasm for your work and for obviously communicating the way in which that industry was changing. But then, all of a sudden, there was another change.
That's right. I spent something like 18 months with the Institute. We were developing training courses. As I said earlier, the whole point was if we could identify sufficient individuals within small companies, medium-sized companies, supermarkets, whatever, if we could identify a group of individuals, we were organising training courses for these people to become trainers inside their own businesses. There was a huge feeling of satisfaction of doing that, because it meant businesses could set up their own training inside and make use, of course, of the further education facility in their own area. But then one day the training development officers had a meeting in London, and as was the case when we had a day's meeting, we were catching up on administrative things and hearing the latest news and sitting down and discussing aspects of developing our own work. There was a team of 6 training development officers, I should say, that covered the whole of the UK. But one day, as was the case, we went off to the local pub. It's a standard thing. It would be half a pint of beer and a beef sandwich. But on that particular day, I overheard somebody behind me say, "I hear Watson Phillip are looking for a training officer in Dundee." And I couldn't believe my ears. Here's a tiny little advert that had taken me out of the grocery trade into commercial college. An advert which turned up on a page within the staff room took me to the Grocers Institute. And here was a comment behind me about a job in Dundee. And I'd only left Dundee 18 months or so before. But I went home that evening, made a phone call, and to cut a long story short, found myself having an interview with the managing director of one of the divisions of a company called Watson Phillip, which was in those days purely a wholesale grocery business. And that's what took me there. So I had 3 totally unexpected pieces of fortune, good fortune, that I found myself, after these years of dropping my salary and wondering if I'd made a huge error in leaving William Lowe and Company in the first place, I felt I'd regained a large part of my earning power, but equally and more importantly, I think I'd gained a wider knowledge of the whole business of training, education and the grocery trade. And the prospect of coming back to work in Dundee seemed again to be too good to be true.
Well, one thing that runs right the way through your story in the 1960s, and which connects your experiences with William Lowe, the Commercial College, the Grocers Institute, and then obviously Watson and Phillip, is that you were really driving knowledge at a time when there was enormous flux in the market. The industry was changing, attitudes were changing, society was changing. And it seems to me that you were very much at the forefront of it. You were making sure that that knowledge was being properly disseminated and that everybody was able to make the best use of it.
That's right, Tom. One doesn't actually feel aware of that at the time. I was aware of the changes in the grocery trade in a practical fashion, moving from counter service to self-service. I was aware of the opportunities in further education, and indeed in the 5 years I was in the college I did see a growth in the number of students, and there was an improving attitude towards further education. And the Grocers Institute have to be given huge credit for their investment. They had quite large sums of money. They were the national, i.e. UK-wide body that held together the communications and the driving force within the grocery trade. So they were a central force on marketing, legal issues, training issues, and so the Grocers Institute held great sway within the trade. So that was highly important, and of course I began to see all of that. I didn't link exactly the crest of the wave I was on, but that's in fact, yes, very true, Tom. I saw the changes coming through from a practical sphere, a further education sphere, and a training aspect as well. All of these, in their own ways, were finding new things to go. So in the 1960s, if I sum it all up, in that period of 10 years, each of these 3 constituent parts of life connected with the grocery business, they were in the forefront. Things were changing. The government, obviously itself, by introducing training boards, was obviously aware of the need, not just in retail distribution, but there was a training board for every industry in the whole of the UK. There was an emphasis on improving productivity, efficiency, and managerial aspects, and that was, yes, quite a unique combination of events, I think, Tom, that took me through from the beginning to the end of that decade.
And on that note, that subject of change, it would be remiss of me not to ask given that your book starts just prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis and continues all the way until the first human being to land on the moon in 1969, how did it feel, that period of cultural transition? I mean, what was your own personal take on the events that you were witnessing?
I was a workaholic, Tom, that's the first thing to say. I spent a lot of time preparing lecture notes if it was in the college. If I take the grocery trade, I worked long hours in a practical sense. In the college, I was preparing and writing notes for teaching purposes. And in the Grocer's Institute, we were creating new training courses. I spent most of my time doing all of that. But the changes that were going on suddenly were happening around me. I'm not quite sure what would stand out for me most of all in all of that. I think politically and in the context of and I think looking back, we've still got the same problems. If that makes any sense, I would say that probably these will always be the main elements in life: politics and social aspects of living. I didn't set out in my first book to write any social history of the 1950s, nor indeed did I set out to write the social aspects of changes in life in the 1960s. But all I would say now, today, as we speak, with the giant supermarkets and the huge pressures on large companies to eke out their share of the market, it now puts into focus that what was going on in my life in the 50s and in the 60s was in fact the early stages of change of this continuum that's going on. I don't know where it will be in 10 or 20 years. There's a whole lot of theories about where it will be in 10 or 20 years. But right now, we've got a very buoyant and highly competitive world. And in my early days on my message bike, I didn't think I'd be seeing in the 2020s vans doing deliveries. In other words, the modern message boy delivering from a van. But yes, the changes that were happening then were the first real changes that probably had happened for the previous 50, 60, 70 years. They were beginning to change in the 1950s. And looking back now, yes, that was the precursor for what we have seen in the last 20 years.
Well, I must say, Robbie, I thoroughly enjoyed your book because it fascinates on so many different levels, whether you're talking about the retail industry and very much being on the sharp end of delivering good service to customers, or whether you're talking about further education, where you genuinely were a kind of pioneer who really was there at the beginning of a movement which was going to change so many people's lives, through to training and detailing the changes in the industry at a really pivotal moment in its evolution, and then through to the busy corporate world at Watson and Phillip. It seems that you really have been at the forefront of some really quite remarkable changes. And I think that people will be fascinated to read not just the development of your career, but how it took shape in around that most iconic of decades in the 1960s. So thank you very much for having joined us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. It's thank you.
The Grocer's Boy Rides Again is available to buy from all good online retailers and independent bookshops worldwide. Thanks for joining us today. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremis Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremispublishing.com for details.